This is TWiT.
So, Bleeping Computer had an interesting posting about the endangered status of web browser support for the age-old FTP protocol. And I'm sure, the old-timers among us have put in FTP:// and the name of an FTP server, and a browser today's browsers will understand that, will act as an FTP client, will bring up a connection to a remote FTP server. For those who don't know, that's file transfer protocol, and display the files that are in a directory, and you can click on a file and download it. So, I mean, it's not that different than a browsable directory on a web server, on an HTTP server. The trouble is that FTP is barely and rarely used anymore by the mass of Chrome and Firefox users. I saw some stats that were something like 0.1% over some period of time. So it's not absolutely zero, but it's like the problem is that there have been various attempts to secure FTP in the way that HTTP was secured, but they never took hold, and there are some technical challenges. I recall talking about the NAT traversal challenges of supporting FTP many years ago on this podcast. The trouble is, unlike HTTP, where a single connection is made to a server, FTP by default, there is a variant that is known as passive FTP, but its normal operation uses a pair of TCP connections, one for the so-called control channel and a second connection for the data channel. That second channel is allocated dynamically, where the FTP server that answers the incoming data channel connection, in its response, after they negotiate, tells the client which service port it should use to connect to for its data link. Who knows why that was the way it was designed in the old days, but that's the way it was designed. So this, of course, creates a problem for firewalls and NAT routers, which adopted the practice, which is what we talked about years ago, and which it remains in use today, of actively snooping on the FTP protocol control messages in order to determine which secondary connection they need to allow for inbound. So when they see the servers that is behind them telling an external FTP client, oh, make your inbound data connection on port whatever, the NAT router sees that and goes, ooh, and opens up. It like performs its own NAT mapping, opening up on the fly a port to receive the now expected incoming FTP client data connection. So it's now that gets complicated when you add security. In fact, it becomes impossible if the FTP control connection is encrypted using something like TLS, since what is then a deliberate man-in-the-middle firewall or NAT router cannot determine the TCP port number for the secondary data connection, which has been negotiated between the client and the FTP server, because it's encrypted. There have been, as I mentioned, some attempts to secure FTP, but mostly, first of all, that they have succeeded, like doing FTPS, simply layering TLS on top of FTP in a way analogous to the way we added TLS to HTTP, wouldn't work for that reason, for the fact that we're currently depending upon being able to snoop on that traffic in order to handle the FTP protocol in its standard mode. And of course, there's the whole issue of the web browser's attack surface being kept open and expanded for this use for a protocol that virtually no one uses through their browser any longer. The point is that the browsers are currently supporting this and thus have an available surface for attack that they have to keep maintaining even though it's not in use. So it's not that FTP itself isn't a useful application protocol for cross-internet file transfer, but first of all, standalone full-featured FTP clients are available for every platform. If I don't know if our listeners know, but Windows has long had an FTP client command line. If you open a command line and enter FTP and hit enter, you're in an FTP client. And if you type help, you get a large list of available commands and you can do FTP stuff. And then if you type quit, you'll exit the client and come back to the Windows command prompt. And of course, all operating systems that are in use today on some level support it. And so what's happened is that the insecure and insecurable FTP has become sort of the lowest common denominator for internet file transfer. First of all, oftentimes just HTTP with S. HTTPS will allow you to download files. GRC has some directories where I explicitly make them available for developers to grab stuff that I'm working on. When I was working on SpinRite 6, I had a SpinRite 6 directory and people could browse around in that. And in fact, I had to deliberately put a text file in the directory starting with an underscore, so it would be at the top of the list that says this directory is deliberately publicly accessible, because I would get helpful notes from people saying, Steve, you realize you've got an exposed directory on your, it's like, yes. Anyway, so the point is you can do this in a secure fashion already with HTTPS if all you want to do is make files available for download, and even with directory browsing and the other things that FTP allows. And as you mentioned, Leo, when we were talking about this at the top of the show, there have been successful variations. There is SCP, which is the secure copy.
Actually, that's the one I use. I use that one all the time. Yeah.
Yes.
That's under
SCP.
SSH, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's another one. There is an SFTP, which is another use of SSH for file transfer. There's even FISH, FISH, which is file transfer over shell protocol. So, there have been solutions to this. It doesn't affect anyone today, but just sort of as an early note to our listeners, if something you're doing, and I can't imagine why, but if it seems it's like, okay, if something you're doing requires FTP through a browser, just an early heads up that both Google and Mozilla are kind of looking at this thinking, we're going to have to retire this somehow. So it may well be that at some point in the future, we're discussing the announcement that version X of Chrome and Y of Firefox are planning to remove their native support for this venerable and increasingly obsolete protocol. So, it may happen.